Should Christians support Israel? Isn't that the question of the day? My goodness.
No!
Wow, what a loaded. I feel like I got to go Jordan Peterson here and say, it depends on what you mean by Christian, and it depends on what you mean by Israel. But honestly, it's such a loaded question now, and it has become sort of the wedge issue on the right or among Christians, among conservatives. And it's not a question that I've sought to answer definitively much ever before. It's just kind of been there floating around in the ether. But I feel like now it's come to a point where things are hinging on the answer to this question. And if you don't have a thought through position, you can be swept up into people with agendas that are pushing a certain narrative, or vice versa. You can be, I guess on either side, you can be swept up into it. And it just behooves us as thoughtful Americans, as thoughtful people who may be right-leaning, as thoughtful Christians, to kind of look at the scriptural basis for this question, and in the sense that that's being asked in a biblical sense, and look at it through the political lens as well, and then determine whether those two are even related at all, and let that sort of foundation inform your sort of outlook and political affiliations and choices or whatever. And even more than what you decide to do, it's also like the information that's out there and the people who are spinning narratives and talking about this issue and trying to use it to achieve whatever political ends, whether it's on the pro-Israel side or the anti-Zionist side or whatever it may be. It's easy to get swept up in all this conversation. So I don't have a firm, if you're looking for like a simple, firm, hot take answer on all this, that's not really the goal of this discussion, but it is to kind of just open it up, look at sort of the different biblical interpretations that have become, I guess, Christian support for Israel in the U.S., and also divorcing it from the theology and looking at it just as a political question and kind of, see where that leads us. So I'm going to lean on Tay a little bit, and I think we should start with a theological question because a lot flows from that, or we might get into whether it should or shouldn't, but a lot does seem to flow from how you answer the theological question of whether Christians should support the modern day state of Israel, if that's even what we mean by saying Christians should support Israel. Yeah. So Tay, I'm vaguely familiar with like some of these, persuasions, theological persuasions around this question, but honestly, it's not something I've studied in depth, and I know I'm not going to put you in the position of being an expert on it either, but you're probably more learned than me when it comes to Bible nerd stuff. So can you kind of lay out the theological basis for support of Israel as some people see it, and then the theological basis against it?
Yeah. So, and I was telling Taylor before we got on the call, I'm going to talk more conceptually. I don't have prepared like a chapter and verse for all of these, and so you guys are free to Google search and chat GPT me and all that good stuff as I kind of share it, but I'll just give the broad outlines, and then if you want to dig any deeper into it, we can. So for people that are Zionists and support Zionism, the big idea is that throughout the Old Testament, we see that God has a particular interest in his people, the nation of Israel. And we see that thread all throughout the Old Testament. And it really centers around this idea that's found in Genesis 12, where God tells Abram, which this actually gets misquoted often by people that are Zionists. But there's a verse in Genesis 12 where God tells Abram, whose obviously name changes to Abraham, but he says that I'm going to bless you, and the nations that bless you will be blessed. And the nations that are against you, they're going to be cursed. Where it gets misquoted is people will talk about how it says that, like, whoever blesses Israel, but it doesn't say whoever blesses Israel. It talks about whoever blesses Abraham, like who blesses him. And so, like, that's a little bit of a distinction. I think it is worth making, though, because if it does sound, because a lot of people do think it just full-blown flatly says, you can make an inference from the Abraham concept and kind of, drag it from there. So there seems to be this thread that God has, starting with that concept in Genesis 12, and you see a particular interest God has throughout the Old Testament. When we then move into the New Testament, people that are supporters of Zionists, they still see that there is a unique interest that God does seem to have with this people. And they will highlight that in some of Paul's writings, particular in Romans. Paul will talk about his fellow brothers according to the flesh, referring to Israelite people, referring to Jewish people. And by referring to them as that, he talks about how he'd be willing to be cut off for the sake of their salvation, how God is using the Gentiles, the non-Jews coming into the church in order to save Israel. There's these Bible verses that say all of Israel will be saved. Even when you get into Revelation, there are pictures of Christ returning, imagery of Christ returning, where it'll be in Jerusalem, and there's all these ideas that are kind of woven in. So that's kind of this big idea, the big contours, that God still has a particular interest in the Jewish people, in the people of Israel. He has not revoked his special favor on them. And so Zionism continues as this thread. So therefore, we should continue to bless Israel, support Israel. They are still God's people. And if a nation, then that moves into the national part, because obviously in Genesis 12, it's talking about nations. And so like as a country, as a nation, we want God's hand of blessing on us as a country. So therefore, we as a country should support the country of Israel. So that's kind of the big idea. When you move over into people who do not support Zionism, they will agree with you about there being a thread throughout the Old Testament, about God having a unique focus on a particular people. However, what they will emphasize, and this is why it's important for them, that God doesn't say if you don't bless Israel, you won't be blessed, but whoever does not bless you, referring specifically to Abraham, and why that differentiation is important to them, is because when you get into the New Testament, while Paul does have a particular interest at times, and he's talking about the Jewish people specifically as he relates to them in the flesh naturally, there's this bigger idea that gets introduced, and it's that not all of Israel was Israel. That like within Israel, there was this actual Israel, the true Israel, the real Israel. And those were not just people who had national or ethnic identity. It was people that had fidelity and loyalty to Yahweh, and that to God, it was never just about like, oh, this is just an ethnic nation of people. It's that who are the people within this ethnic nation that will remain faithful to me, which is why you also see non-Jewish, ethnically non-Israeli people still being a part of the story of God's people throughout the Old Testament. It's the whole book of Ruth. Like the entire book of Ruth is just, like this whole, you're focused on a Moabite woman and things like that, but she plays this central role, all that good stuff. So anyway, so they're going to say that the reason why it's important is because the scripture says that we, the people of faith, are the children of Abraham. So that's why for them it's important to make a distinction that it doesn't say whoever blesses Israel will be blessed, but whoever blesses Abraham, because Paul specifically says, we are the children of Abraham. Jesus even rebukes some of the Jewish people, and he tells them, your father is not Abraham, your father is Satan. And he's talking to ethnically Israeli Jewish people. So they're going to argue that the church is the true Israel. And what they mean by church, they're just simply saying it has always been. Like, it's not like something has pivoted or something has changed or there's now something that's different. It has always been those that are faithfully loyal to Yahweh, to God. Those are the ones that are God's people, that his hand of blessing are on. And if you are against those people, you will be cursed. That was always the thread. We just see the fulfillment of what it means to be a part of that group of people in the gospel, in Christ. And so you become a Christian. So Christians are this new Israel, but Israel has always just been people that have been faithful to God. So they're going to say we don't have any obligation to the nation state. It was never about the nation state. It's about this people of faith. It's about the true children of Abraham, the true Israel. It's not about any particular nation. So that's the big idea, the broad contours of the two different sides in this discussion.
So as it pertains to American politics, because now we get into the question of should Christians support Israel, but like from a political perspective, should conservatives or people who are Christian in America, when it comes to you're a Christian, you happen to live in America, how do you connect your theology around Israel to political belief or political, outcomes? And it seems like historically there's the sort of Zionist perspective has been the dominant one on the conservative right. Would you say so?
Yeah, and it's specifically, you know, the dominance of it. It's like the Zionist group. It's very specific. It is white evangelicals. Like, I mean, it's the overwhelming in America. It's the overwhelming majority of white evangelicals in America that are Zionists, and that ties into this broader influence of white evangelicalism that has been greatly influenced by it's premillennial dispensationalism. But long story short, they're very into end times. They're very into ushering in the end times. Like that's the big idea. We don't need to get into all of like all of the differences of like one's eschatology, the end of the time. But if you've been around white evangelicals, which I've been around them, Taylor's been around them, there's a big emphasis, and I would say it's a good zeal to have on wanting to, the phrasing they would use is ushering in the return of Christ. And so it's not just purely this vague, like, oh, we should support Israel. It's often tied to, like, we should support Israel because it's God's people, and they play an intrinsic role in the end times, Christ returning. And we want to be about ushering in that. And so that's kind of the theological, like, world they live in. And then from that, they then make conclusions and assumptions, if you will, but that is serving as their presuppositional position to then apply to their politics and their policy and, you know, things like that. So it's unique in that group that it's very prevalent with. And so, yeah, that largely makes it up. But, you know, as you were saying, there has now kind of been this like there's been this reaction against it more strongly, even within the conservative landscape. And it's been even with a lot of like white mainstream, you know, denominations or reformed denominations, and even more Orthodox are speaking out and stuff like that.
I was looking this up while you're talking, just to kind of get a sense of the influence of white evangelicals, at least presently in politics. They're roughly 35 to 40% of Trump's presidential vote in raw exit poll math. And they make up 21 to 23% of all voters. So that's a very significant portion of the U.S. electorate. And you can trace this influence going back decades. It's hard to parse out, because last night I was reading a little bit too about the influence of Protestant evangelicalism more generally. And that goes back to like before the founding. You had like Great Awakening. You had, you know, the Pilgrims, people fleeing religious persecution by Catholics, by the Church of England in Europe, and that was a huge part of the American founding. And it was this sort of sola scriptura persuasion, this Protestant persuasion that fostered a lot of early literacy in the U.S. as far as like people learning to read so they could read the Bible for themselves. That also connects to the development of the sort of American individualistic identity, and the notions of personal responsibility, and this sort of biblically informed ethics and worldview, and this idea that like you are directly accountable to God as an individual for your actions, for your life, and you are directly responsible to formulate a sort of theology and a worldview on your own, and you don't outsource that to the church, to a governing body, to anyone else. And that was pretty new in history, and a lot of what we appreciate and enjoy as American culture flows from that specific reality. So when we talk about white evangelicals, they are also the standard bearers, or like the inheritors of that tradition, or and they're not exclusive. Like Zionism doesn't define that voting bloc per se. It simply is attached to it, for better or for worse, and it looks like increasingly for worse, perhaps. But it's easy to just latch onto one part of this conversation and then be myopic about it and only, we want the quick answer to the current political question now. It's like, okay, war in Iran, support it or oppose it. I'm going to oppose it because it's a Zionist thing, and the Jews are controlling us. Blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, let's slow down for a second and like absorb the broader landscape, the historical landscape, and kind of I'm just trying to wrap my head around what's going on more broadly on the right. And it seems to me that this question of Zionism, it's become a focal point because it is a vulnerability. It's an effective point of argument. Like, I have this theory about public discourse where like influencers and people that be, especially since in the new media age, the conversations are not being optimized around truth seeking or like reasonable responses or consensus building or anything like that. They're optimized around narratives that mobilize people and persuade people to click, to follow, to vote, to, throw their voice or power behind whoever can persuade them. So the persuaders are optimizing for whatever they can mobilize people. And this Zionist Israel question has a lot of power in that domain to displace long-standing sort of convictions and blocks, and you're seeing that on the right. The younger generation is very Charlie Kirk was really into this. Like, he was sitting down with Gen Z conservatives, and almost to a man or woman, there was no supporters of Israel, no supporters of Zionism, and it seems like there's also become this conflation where like the entire U.S. Israeli and I'm talking about the nation state now, but the entire U.S. Israeli relationship is painted with this brush of Zionism and Zionist influence. And that is as much the fault of the people who gave Israel undue, reverence and privilege at Israel, the country, from a misapplying a theological perspective, perhaps, as it is the people who maliciously want to paint Israel as this exploitative, manipulative nation states and people that is, manipulating the naive American right to its purposes, or buying them off or blackmailing them with, evidence of people being pedophiles or whatever. I don't know, man. It's a mess.
Yeah, well, one, I wanted to just, commentate, if you will, on what you were saying, like, it's a vulnerability. Even if Zionism is true, I do think the way it has been portrayed is a vulnerability. And I think that is why, if it is true, I think the pushback is needed, because you see it all the time. Like, and I just think a lot of this very like shallow rhetorical use of propagandizing, because you can use shallow rhetorical propaganda for truthful things. It's not like you can only do it for untruthful. You can do it for truthful things as well. But it's like, dude, it just doesn't work anymore if you just get up there and you're just like, we're going to go to war and we're going to send all this money to this country because we stand with Israel. God bless her. Like, that just doesn't fly anymore. No. And so even if it's true, okay, but what about, this to me, it reminds me of like the young earth creationist conversation. Even if young earth creationism is true, I think all the pushback it's gotten recently is good for it, because like, okay, you can't just say anymore, it's what the Bible says, and so therefore, well, it's like, okay, well, there's more substantive questions that are going to come up. Okay, well, I know it says that, but it doesn't say anything about this, so what do we do about this? And so that's why even all of these like hardcore young earth creationist organizations and people, none of them are just simply like, oh, well, we just believe that's what the Bible says, therefore so be it. Like, all of them start these organizations to actively try to disprove and undermine modern biological sciences and modern cosmology. All of them do it because they're like, oh, like, there's real questions and people are actually asking them and we need to answer them. And just simply saying, well, that's what Genesis says, they're admitting it's insufficient by starting these whole organizations that become nonprofits that generate millions of dollars a year in order to prove their position. So they know it's not just merely sufficient to just point to a verse. They know that they have to do more work under it. So I think the same thing with the Zionism thing, man. It just has become this like, oh, we can just stand in front of the American electorate and we can just simply declare we stand with Israel, and that just gives us the pass on any bill we want to pass, any funding. And so I think people are just like, look, dude, you gotta bring more to the table. So I think that's good. I think the part though that obviously is not good is that, unfortunately, from my vantage point, this has always been a very thoughtful, important question within Christian theology and Christian doctrine for Christians to discuss, for them to debate. But what's unfortunate for me is that it's gotten hijacked by politics. And so because the question is now first a political question and it's not first a theological question, then what ends up happening is kind of what you were getting at a moment ago. It's now it's no longer even a question of who's right and who's wrong. Now anyone who's wielding it they're often wielding it not to teach theology and to teach doctrine. They're wielding it in order to push agendas about other things, and this becomes a way by which they're able to do that. So like right now, there is no political baggage to like questions regarding Calvinism versus Arminianism, right? Like there's no political baggage. So if you want to dig into that question, you just have to kind of dig into the theology and the doctrine of it. But let's say the Christian nationalists win the day, right? Let's say they win, America becomes this Christian nation. And then like let's say you then find out that like 80% of the American public is Arminian, right? That obviously is going to now have an impact on like if you're running for office and you're like, well, crap, 80%, like even if you're a Calvinist, but you realize like 80% of the electorates are Arminianists, you're going to start like, well, we got to compromise. We got to say the right thing, because it's now become this political conversation. It's not a theological conversation. It's about like policy and votes and power and all that stuff like that. So I always hate it when it's inevitable. There's no way to stop it. I think that's why Christians need to be on the front line of teaching theology and teaching doctrine and not just merely reacting to the political conversations of the day. Mm-hmm. I think that's why we need to be taking initiative and talking about these things and how they matter, so that when these things then come up already, like I do think that's one of the benefits of Wes Huff and how he has grown to significant prominence. He has not been making content speaking to the cultural moment. He was making nerdy content about the Bible and theology and doctrine.
Scrolls of parchment.
Exactly. And then it just so happened that the cultural moment aligned with things he's been talking about for decades.
Yeah, that was like Jordan Peterson too.
Exactly. He's a great example of that. So all that to say, it's like by just focusing on, and again, I'm not saying so like let's avoid the conversation on Zionism. It's lost. We can't like, okay, well, too late. Like if we didn't do the work, too late. It's here, so we do have to talk about it. It's just unfortunate when that gets woven into it, because now you have this whole other monster to deal with while just simply trying to answer a theological question and do good, serious Bible study. You now have this whole other thing to deal with. A good example of it, it's like people today, when it comes to the question about like homosexuality and gay marriage and stuff like that. Yeah. It just has gotten like, now when people come to the question, young people come to the question today, they now come to it with more cultural baggage, that even if you lay out the most clear biblical argument, you now have to additionally deal with the emotional, personal, cultural baggage that now comes with it. So even though, yes, it's a theological doctrinal question, we are not just theological doctrinal brain machines that just simply resound to intellectual, doctrinally sound truth. We are complex. God made us that way. We do respond to culture and to emotions and to our lived experiences. And like all that's a real part of how God built us to interact with the world. And so, I don't have like a pin on that point. It's just a broader observation about like.
No, it's good. Yeah.
I think it sucks that this conversation has gotten politically hijacked, because now we have to deal with that side of it. So even if people are just merely trying to approach it from this like theological, doctrinal, I just want to understand the Bible, what's likely the case is they're being motivated by their like political tribe in this like split that's happening within conservatism. And so they first identify with where they find themselves there, and then they go to the question already locked into a bit of a position because that position fits their broader political like worldview that they've crafted. And so now it becomes more about like, it's not a form of like virtue signaling. It's kind of like more of a form of like doctrine signaling, or I don't know.
Like group signaling.
Yeah, just this broader group signaling. And so I think that's why, you know, it's unfortunate that this has kind of served as the catalyst that brought the conversation to the fore.
Yeah, but I think the parallels you draw with the evolution debates and the marriage and sexuality debate are very, very apt, because it's like Jordan Peterson will say, like, you never get away with anything. When you have a bad, like, argument or belief or action, even if even if in the temporary moment you build a political movement based on this, you know, bad theology or good theology that you're just putting toward political aims, it's you're not going to get away with it in the end. And even if on a temporary basis, like you advance what you think is the right thing or the interest, like it's going to crumble and collapse. And I think that's what happened with like the creationist sort of movement, to when you step outside the bounds of, you know, your God-given reason and rational faculties and try to impose your interpretation, strict interpretation of biblical passages on top of objective reality and truth, like that's a disaster waiting to happen. And it caused a lot of cultural havoc, avoidable cultural havoc, if those, you know, fundamentalist Christians had a little more humility and good, like, were a little more self-aware in that debate. And I think that we're seeing the exact same dynamics at play with this Zionism question. And it's like, it seems like we're kind of, the time's come to pay the piper with the edifice that's been built of this whole Zionist project that's, you know, built on shoddy theology, or even if the theology's not necessarily wrong, in like to its very bottom, the effort to politicize even what might be reasonable theology, and the effort to advance, like, the effort to use political power and wield political power, it just never works, man. It just never works. It's putting on the ring, and you don't do that.
And real quick, it reminds, like, the way I have seen, regardless if Zionism is true or not, the way I've seen a lot of Zionists use the you know, their Bible verses and the concept of Zionism, to me it has a lot of resonance with how progressives will use the verse about loving your neighbor. And so they just like impose that verse, and then they just infer from it all of this policy about open borders, about universal health care and universal wages and pay, and like they just impose the verse, and they just unravel all of it from there, right? And so, like, and again, even I do think that the Bible verse is true. Love your neighbor as yourself. I think that is accurate. I think we should do that. I think we are morally obligated before Jesus Christ. But you can't just simply impose that verse and then just merely infer from all of that policies about our border. I would say in the same way, even if Zionism is true, you can't just impose God's people as the nation of Israel. Therefore, here's this big spending bill for $30 billion to Israel. We're going to send our people to war. And I do think that's some of the reaction you're having, regardless, because you can take a truthful concept and extrapolate from it false application.
Exactly.
And so I do think some of what you're experiencing is people are like, dude, even if this is true, like, why did we send all this money here? Why did we get into this fight? Why did we lose people to this? Is this really benefiting me? Is this really benefiting our country? And what they see on the other side of it, like, as they are asking these questions, they finally get to the bottom of the answer. And the bottom of the answer is some, 65-year-old white dude who grew up in the Bible Belt South and, once pressed with needing to make an account of all of these issues, His answer is, I stand with God's people. And like, that's it. Like, that's the, you know, that's the end of it. Like, that is the bottom of the, and people are going to have, like, I think rightfully so, because I think that that's a crappy answer.
Of course.
I think that's a bad, I think even if you are, like, you just have to, even if you are a Zionist and you are utterly convinced, that is a bad answer to a good, meaningful question. And I don't think God wants us to have that answer. I don't think, you know, in Peter, he talks about, like, giving a good reason for the faith that you have, providing a defense. In the mindset of the apostles, they never thought that, like, you would get into an argument with someone and you would just simply say, well, the Bible says so, like, merely, like, that's it. Yeah. Oh, I believe Jesus rose again from the dead because the Bible said so. And that's the end of it. Now, again, if that's personally where you are, like, that's fine. But you have to understand that's not, he didn't just give us that for a reason. And so, you know, and then you throw on top of it, you know, creating whole policy and, you know, building an entire political system around it. Yeah, I think that's a very like realistic, you know, reaction to it.
Yeah. And I think the unfortunate thing is that, I don't know if it's, I guess it's a form of bad faith to have this, like, unconditional support of Israel, theological support of Israel or whatever. Because there are people like that. We know that those people exist. We know that they try to exert influence on politicians. We know that is like a movement with a pulse. Now, I think it is honestly a diminishing faction on within the right. I think the political influence of, like, straight up Zionist people who only justify supporting Israel militarily or financially or whatever, on the basis of Zionism. I think that is, at least in the overt sense, people who overtly are only making the, like, they're not taken as seriously anymore. Now, they're the undercurrent, you know, residual remnant of decades of that kind of ideology being in the ether on the right, that has a debatable amount of influence on U.S. policy. But what it does have is the ability to validate the accusations and concerns of anyone who is doubtful of the freedom of U.S. policymaking from the undue influence of Zionist ideology. So anyone who wants to say, well, America's only supporting Israel because of these Zionist shills, there's evidence they can point to. There's evidence they can point to, the money that's, you know, in politics around Israel, the words of different Zionist movers and shakers in the political realm, whether it's elected politicians or people who fund it or activists or whatever. You know, and that's where this whole project has backfired and really poisoned the well, because imagine a world in which the nation state of Israel is a militarily competent ally that one of America's only militarily competent allies, if you think about it. Europe is completely feckless. They've relied on the U.S. and NATO and the UN for so long that they basically can do nothing militarily and are useless in any serious political confrontation with China or Russia or whatever, what have you. Australia, ditto. Like, look at who your allies are and who has military competence. Israel's pretty much your only one. And then look at the ideological alignment and the interests alignment. It's there with Israel, just full stop, compared to the ideological and interest alignment with radical Islamists or radical Islamist regimes, compared to that with China, compared to that with Russia. We are not ideologically or interest aligned with any of these other nations, or at least to the degree that we are with Israel. But if you want to make an argument on that basis, someone can always, and that results in military alliance with or support of Israel, or like cooperation with Israel as in this Iran war, that discussion is always now going to be tainted with the specter of this sort of Zionist influence. And there's no There's no real way to get rid of it because it's been there. And here's the thing: when it was politically expedient to embrace that, you did, and that was used. Hence the sticky situation where we've been, and people have a lot of due suspicion and doubts and skepticism around anything having to do with Israel because of that. So if it puts people who, like President Trump, who want to make the argument on a basis of merits and as on a basis of, hey, here's the legitimate rationale for this military action against Iran because of the nuclear threat, because of the ballistic missile threat to our bases and the region, because of their stockpile of drones, because of their funding of proxy terror groups of Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, because of their decades of active war against the U.S., by calling U.S. the big Satan, by funding terror activities against us, killing 1,000 of our soldiers, kidnapping our people out of the embassy. It's like, cool, none of that matters, though, because I don't trust that you're acting independent of Zionist influence. And it's just interesting, too, because, like, I don't think Donald Trump's decision-making with regard to Middle East policy is theological in nature.
Yeah, I totally agree.
But it's like that doesn't matter, because there's such a cloud of suspicion around anything to do with Israel that even if you're doing things purely because you sincerely believe it is in the best interest of the U.S., or that our sworn suicidal Islamic jihadist enemy is, by their own admission in negotiations, very close to having a certain amount of enriched uranium and close to having the capacity to have a nuclear weapon, which would allow them to entrench themselves in the region by having the threat of using nuclear force. That's what happened with North Korea, and North Korea has been doing its thing for nigh on 60, 70 years now, because we can't invade them, because they will drop a nuclear bomb if we try to invade them. But at least North Korea doesn't have ambitions to kill every non-infidel that doesn't follow their religion in the world, and doesn't have the ambition to, colonize the entire world with their Islamic sort of worldview, which Iran does. So if Iran gets that nuclear weapon, like, not a good thing, especially given the amount of damage they've been able to exact without one. So anyways, but I'm in this weird position where it's like, I see how regrettable it is that there's been so much ammo given to the skeptics and to the doomers to say, well, this is all just Trump being manipulated by Netanyahu, and this is all an extension of Zionism and blah, blah, blah. Because there's also, just completely divorced from that, a very meritorious, rational case that this is in the U.S. interest. But we can't even really have that debate because it's not about the merits of the argument. It's about the suspicion of the motives. Yep. And because we're only in that land, people make up their minds based on their feeling of the merit of the suspicion and not their feeling of the merit of the geopolitical strategy. And so it's tough because, like, I want to have the geopolitical debate, and I want to see the arguments that are like, have nothing to do with the Zionist side of things. Exactly. And let's like really hash that out and see, and explore those, but we can't even get there. And nobody's interested in that conversation because we're stuck in the land of suspicion. But also, as a Christian, I can't ignore, and as like a conservative, as a Christian, as a white evangelical, whatever, I can't ignore that part of the debate that's inconvenient to me because this is the institutional reality, the objective reality of the political landscape in the U.S. And, my voting bloc, the voting bloc of which I happen to be part, because of its worse elements, is responsible for a lot of the, giving weight to the suspicion and to the doubt and whatever, because there have been silly actors out there who are just running with this very shallow Zionist view of unconditional support for Israel. And like, you don't get away with that. You don't get away with it. And so welcome to the chaos. But I guess, and we're coming up on 45 minutes here, but I want to hear your thoughts on all that. But my next kind of thought is like, where do we go from here? Because whatever happens in Iran is going to happen with Iran. But like the next election, the next generation of conservatives, the next generation of where the right is, there is sort of this large undercurrent on the right, especially among the young, especially among influencers like, the Tucker Carlsons and the Candace Owens which I don't even, it's hard to even call these people right wing anymore or conservative, because when's the last time they've said anything conservative or anything that is in the interest of conservatives or Republicans getting elected in the next year or in the near future? I haven't heard anything. But there's this growing cohort that has infiltrated the right, that wants to reshape it. And there's a healthy way to divorce ourselves from this sort of using Zionism as a rationale from political decisions. There's a healthy way to excise that out of conservatism, and to a large degree, honestly, I think it has been excised in actuality, but it hasn't been excised in perception. And the people who wish to reshape the right in a more profound way than merely making that change are using the perception of Israel's undue influence and Zionism's undue influence on the right. They're using it as a wedge to get in and enact their broader agenda or start to infiltrate their broader agenda. And I think it looks like massive changes are coming on the right, and it's not going to be pretty. And I think a lot of like I was talking before about that deeper connection to biblical literacy and Protestant work ethic and like deep-seated American values and culture that flow from that, original pre-Zionist evangelical persuasion and evangelical Protestant persuasion. I think that is what is in the targets of these new right figures. And it's almost like the Christian nationalism which they want to import kind of follows what you were talking about, of that theological persuasion which places the church as the chosen people. I think they're placing that Christian nationalism places like Christian nationalist people, they take up that banner of we are God's chosen people, not people who are transformed through the gospel by repentance and their hearts are dead to their old self and raised anew with Christ. And that's not what they mean by Christian, the chosen people of God now. What they mean is people who are on board with the Christian nationalist project of bringing sort of an authoritarian form of Christianity or Catholicism or whatever to the American right, and that's their project, and the flag that they're waving, and they're using the inverse of Zionism, the opposite theological persuasion, to sort of infiltrate Protestants or evangelicals and dissuade them of Zionism and persuade them of neo-Zionism, which is actually, another form of using bad theology or badly using theology toward political ends that's going to end up exploding in the end. So a lot there, but, take that wherever you want to.
Yeah. So several things. I want to acknowledge your question of where do we go from here. I'll share my thoughts, and I want to, hear yours as well. So yeah, a few things, and I will try to keep it brief since we're coming up on time. One, yes, you're talking about how the conversation's now tainted because there's this specter of the Zionist in you wanting to have the geopolitical conversation about U.S., their allies, and their interests, and things that are happening in the Middle East, and the influence of Islam, and protecting the Western culture, and that broader conversation. But if you do go into it with a pro-Israeli ally angle primarily, you're just aware of this specter, and so it's like, how do we actually have the meaningful conversation? Well, and I also think that that's happening on the other side. So to, kind of come to the defense, if you will, of the Zionists, I think for the Zionists, there's this specter of the other side of anti-Semitism. And so they're looking at the other side and they're like, are you trying to have a geopolitical conversation, or have you gotten pulled into the cult of the Jews are evil, right? Because and you're just trying to use the geopolitical conversation as a mask. But deep down, you've just fallen into the other cult, because to me, both of these ideas are cultic. And regardless of whatever ideas are true, I think that ideas can be propagated through cultic ways. Like, I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus, but I do think that a large part of my Christian foundation was sown in a cultic environment, in a cultish environment, right? And a lot of the ideas were impressed upon me in that type of a culture. I still believe it's true. The substance of Christianity is true, but the way in which a lot of the ideas of it and the practices of it, the way it was portrayed to me, was in an environment like that. So I think that there's this cult of Zionism that pushes the idea that the ethnically Jewish person is wholly sanctified and pure in all of their motives and all of their ways, right? Like, they can almost do no wrong, think no wrong. So if they're going to war, that's God's war, baby, and we're getting behind it. If they want $30 billion, God's asking for that $30 billion, and we're going to give it to them. If they are making this decision about expansion, or they're going to that, and so it sanctifies every decision, every choice, every individual, every policy, every election. It sanctifies it. And it has been pushed, it has grown broadly because of just propaganda. This idea, we stand with Israel, that's God's people, God's going to bless us. And it's just, using these phrases. I think, but then what you then see is the way that people have brought people out of that isn't by providing the geopolitical conversation. They've not gone, all right, now look, let's kind of step back. Is this really in our best interest as a country? Hey, regardless if Zionism is true or not, let's look at this, look at this war, and is it really benefiting us? And just because we should support these people, quote unquote, does that really mean that we should just sign off, blank check? No, the way it's been broadly undermined is by the cult of the Jewish people are evil, and anything they do is wicked and impure, and it is satanic. And so these are the two, and then both sides are prejudiced against one another, because both sides are aware that influence is present. We can differ on how much, is the influence primary, is it secondary, but regardless, that influence is present in both of those camps, and that's just something that's just undeniably true. And so when that is then happening on the other side, where people aren't being pulled away from Zionism, and because they did this Bible study, and they started looking into church history and theology and doctrine, they got pulled into being anti-Zionism, not because of a better understanding of biblical truth. They got pulled into anti-Zionism because they've been pulled into anti-Semitism, which is the Jews are evil, they're controlling the world, and every ailment that I'm facing today is because of the Jewish big brother power ecosystem that's controlling the world.
Yeah, it's the inverse of woke.
So
we're oppressed by the white man now.
Exactly. Yeah. There's this pocket of the conservative movement that has fought against woke leftism, which just used to be wokeism, but then the right created its own version of it. They have fought against woke leftism with woke rightism. And so instead of acknowledging the fact that wokeism itself as a way of understanding the world is fundamentally flawed and destructive, they've just simply taken it on, and they go, this works. This is effective. This resonates. This makes sense of my lived experience. And so I'm just going to simply switch out the characters, but the plot very much stays the same. And so that's what's happening. So as much as I would love it if people were coming to whatever conclusion because of this deeply driven biblical study, taking the Bible seriously, there's just been this revival of understanding these, conversations throughout church history and theology. And for some people that is happening, and it's good. But largely all of this has been hijacked and has happened because you have one side, which is the magical, sanctified, Jews can do no wrong, and versus the, people that are pushing they're evil, they're wicked, and Jews can do no good, right? And so both have this specter, both are clashing at one another, both can't. And again, that's why for me this becomes harder to have the conversation about, because I would talk whenever I would when I worked on staff at a church, and conversations about abortion would come up. I would point out to people why the abortion conversation becomes difficult is because we can not that there's not overlap, and I'm like, don't get ahead of me. I'm not saying there's not overlap, and I'm not saying that one does not carry implications for the other, but in a way there's kind of these four buckets on the abortion conversation. There's the bucket of moral or morality. There's the question of moral morality. Is this before God? Is this morally right or wrong? Then there's the question of legality, or the legal question, which is, okay, whether it is right or wrong before God, should there be laws about this thing? Then that moves into the question regarding policy, or the political question, which is, okay, well, if there should be laws about this thing that is right or wrong in the eyes of God, what should the exact laws be and their consequences? And then there's the electoral part of it, which is, okay, well, then what do I do when I need to go to the voting to the voting block, and I need to cast my vote. And I'm not saying that these are unrelated questions. I'm just saying the reason why the conversation becomes difficult is because people jump around to the different buckets within the one conversation. So, like, let's say you take the position, you tell somebody abortion, you start with kind of this moral thing of abortion is wrong to God. God sees it as a sin. And then let's say they just come at you all the way to the policy bucket, and then they go, oh, okay, so if you think abortion's murder, do you think we should throw women in prison for life if they've had an abortion?
Yeah, I see that all the time.
Now, again, I'm not saying we should not get to that question at some point. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a conversation around that question, but what we're doing is we are jumping the different categories of conversation. Regardless if a woman should be thrown in prison or not, let's kind of first settle the moral thing. Can we get on the same page there? Because if we can't even settle that question, you throwing that question at me, the other question, that's just a red herring. You're actually not trying to engage, because something can be immoral before God, but it not then necessarily follow that you should be given a life sentence or the death penalty for the moral thing. So let's just first talk about the moral thing. And I'm not saying that doesn't have any application to the legal or to the policy and the political or to the electoral. So again, let's say if you take the position abortion is wrong, and then someone throws at you, oh, so you're saying I should vote for this candidate? And again, it's like, now I do think all those things flow into one another. I'm very passionate about being anti-abortion. I do want it to be illegal. I don't support candidates that if they are pro-abortion and things like that. But regardless, those are still distinct things. And so what you were talking about with trying to have this conversation, going back to what I was saying earlier and why this becomes difficult, I think this is ultimately where we go forward. I just want to freaking have the geopolitical conversation, man, because I will acknowledge I feel very ignorant about the broader geopolitical landscape of our world. I'll listen to people talk about, and I just know how complicated things like church history can be, because those are more of my fields of being able to dig into scholarship and being able to understand how layered those things are and how much context there is, and how this word at that time didn't quite mean what they were saying it meant 400 years earlier, and this verse says that, but there's different manuscripts, and there's understanding words within context within the ancient Near Eastern culture. I'm a little bit more better able to handle the complexity of the conversation when we're dealing with the Bible and doctrine, theology, church history. I am very ignorant about geopolitics. So when I see things like war in Iran, or the war, with Gaza and Hamas, however you want to frame it. When I hear about these conversations, because there is this theological overlap, and this is a conversation Christians and young Christians are getting pulled into, I want to understand it, but because it's so layered, and because people want to jump from the theology question to the geopolitical question to the, to the anti-Semitism, to the Zionism, to the, eschatology, to the Schofield Bible, to because everyone wants to keep moving the topic, I'm just like, bro, in the same way that, what was that, and this shows you how dumb I am when it comes to geopolitics. what was that? What was that? That country recently that Trump just went in and he just like took out the guy that was in charge.
Venezuela.
Okay,
Yeah,
Venezuela.
Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So when that happened, no one was quoting a Bible verse. People differed on should Trump have done that or not. But the conversation was purely geopolitical.
Yeah.
And it was helpful for me to listen to the people that supported it and the people that were against it. And it was like, again, I'm so unlearned in this world. I don't have like a strong position on it, but I was able to just go, okay, like, this is what these people think. Here's what these people think. This is the debate. Here's the conversation, blah, 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 blah. Like, no one's bringing up Bible verses when it comes to this. So it's like I want to find the atheist that supports a lot, like being an ally of Israel, with the atheist that like doesn't support it. And they just don't care about the theology and the doctrine.
Yeah.
Because like that's the I am as far as like, because as I was telling you before we started this call, Taylor, here's kind of where I'll land the plane. To me, I do think the broader question is inconsequential at the end of the day when it comes to the current political landscape. So for those that are listening, I do not, if you care, I don't lean towards Zionism. I do lean towards this view that like we are God's people, this people that have fidelity towards Yahweh. And, you know, I'm very nuanced with everything I think and I believe. And so there's not time for me to unpack all of it. But if it helps you, I would definitely not say I'm a Zionist. I'm probably a highly modified. I wouldn't really call myself a replacement, you know, either, you know, things like that. But let's just, if it helps you, I'm not that. So all of that said, the reason why to me none of it matters is because even if I were a Zionist, I don't think Zionism entails that you have to support politically and militarily and legislatively all things that, like, let's say if Israel just decided, like, let's say if tomorrow they're like just out of nowhere, they just decide to start a war with Russia. They just are like, we're bombing Russia, we're going in. Like, does that mean we must? Is there? Because I think even in the Old Testament, when God was clearly, these are my people, they would also make really dumb decisions, and he'd be like, I ain't bailing you out of that one. And he's like, that's on you. Like, this is God's people. And he wasn't stepping in every time they got themselves in a mess and being like, let me fix it all for you. He's like, no, suckers, you shouldn't have done that. I didn't say you should do that. You have to deal with your consequences. I was telling Taylor before we started recording, I support my children wholeheartedly. I got their backs, but they're going to want money for things and be like, no, I'm not giving you money for that. And no, I'm not going to help you with that endeavor. And you have to do that one on your own. So to me, it's like, regardless of whether I'm a Zionist or not, I might support the war in Iran. I might not. I might support a spending bill. I might not. I might support a military effort. I might not. Whether I'm a Zionist or not, it doesn't then follow any implications as far as my geopolitical decisions. And I do think people can make choices that have consequences that negatively impact them, and they should live with those consequences, and they should be able to, you know, handle those things on their own. And I'm also open for the ally stuff and everything. So for me, I think where we go forward is we should continue to have the theological conversation and the doctrinal conversation, but we should offload what has become the implication of where you fall on this side. And I think where we go from here, if you're listening, regardless of wherever you fall on this conversation, I think you should spend time learning the geopolitical landscape and having that side of it. And if you land on, it's not a helpful allyship, you know, we shouldn't be in this relationship, it's overall a net negative for our country, great. But if you fall on, I'm not that, but I do see the benefit and things like that, my push for people is you can land on this doctrinally, theologically on either side of it, but still be individualistic when it comes to how you assess policies, spending bills, funding, wars, all of those things. I think you can step back, and it doesn't mean you have to fully be for or fully be against. And I would strongly encourage people, you should not be motivated to look at this topic from feelings of the Jews are sanctified in all that they do versus the Jews are evil and wicked in all that they do. You should be able to look at it from this lens of, okay, like, what does the scripture teach? I just want to settle that question. And I think that's the only thing I could ask this audience to go from here. What impact is that going to make? Dude, this thing has gotten off the rails as far as I'm concerned. People with bigger platforms than me and that are smarter about this conversation need to handle that. My little drop in the bucket, if I was pastoring a church or leading some people, would just be to steer them in that direction.
Yeah, like I said at the beginning, I mean, there is a theological / biblical question, and there is a political question, and they shouldn't be related, but they are, for better or for worse. And I hate that we're unable to have a genuine good faith political discussion, like, or geopolitical discussion, because the well is so poisoned. But I understand why the well is poisoned by the theological question, and that's not, it's the fault of the bad actors who keep bringing it up and deliberately, but it's also the fault of the people who ran with the ill-founded political application of what may or may not be well-founded theology, or just ran politically with bad theology. So, yeah, man. We haven't solved the whole question, but I do, I told Tay before this, like, he rolled his eyes when I said maybe we should talk about whether Christians should support Israel, because he's like, dude, I don't want to talk about that. Like, I don't feel equipped to talk about it, and I don't think anyone does, because we know how hot button it is. But I sense a gap, or, people aren't having these conversations, at least not in a thoughtful way, where they're really trying to get to the core of what's going on, and not just immediately jump to whatever side. And like, and if that's more your vibe, then there's plenty of that out there for you. But hopefully this was a little bit more of a exploratory, let's wrap our heads around this type of conversation around this question. I'm walking away having thought through it a little bit more and having a little bit clearer picture of everything. And that's about as much as you can ask of any, video or podcast or piece of content that you watch these days. Hopefully you're not walking away more outraged. Maybe you're outraged at me and think I'm a Zionist shill, and maybe you think Tay's a, Catholic integrationist, freaking,
hey, bro,
Christian nationalist replacement.
Look, we're both getting our $7,000 check. You know what I'm saying? That's all that matters.
I'm still waiting on mine.
We're both getting funded.
Yeah, hope so. So anyway, let us know what you guys thought, where your head's at in the conversation in the comments, and we'll see you next time.